So, Congress slammed on the brakes. That massive vehicle we call America screeched to a halt just virtual seconds before going over the edge of the fiscal cliff into an economic abyss. That's the drama we've been following, but like any good soap opera, more cliffhangers await. Joining us for a look, Republican analyst Tiene and Democratic analyst Yohuru Williams. Thanks, gentlemen, for coming on board to join us. Always a pleasure to have you. Let's talk first, and I hate to put it in these terms, but let me do it anyway and talk about winners and losers, because this has been shaping up to be a very much a partisan battle as opposed to a bipartisan effort to work to some solution.
The American people lost. The president appears to have, got what he wanted, which is he wanted more revenue, he wanted more taxes. He got that. I think the Republicans lost in how they handled it. I think this was an opportunity lost, both by the president and by the Republicans. There was an opportunity to do something really bold here, and they didn't do it. But the American people lost because we just kicked the can down the road another 2 months.
You sure? You agree?
Couldn't agree more. I mean, in the short term, it looks good for Obama. His approval rating certainly has done well, and Boehner seems to be in trouble based on the decision not to pursue the Superstorm Sandy relief bill that was also being considered at the same time. But at the same time, I agree with John. Everyone loses here. The president didn't get what he wanted. The Republicans certainly didn't get what they wanted. And we're in a position where we're looking at, in 2 months, dealing with these other issues, the sequester, the debt ceiling. None of that's been resolved.
So in that regard, when we look at these other arguments, will legislators have to come back to what they've already decided on or make any changes on that?
All this did was it prevented dramatic tax hikes, did increase taxes on the ultra wealthy, depending on how you define that, did some other tax management issues, and averted from the perception of going over the cliff, but we didn't deal with the spending side of it at all. I mean, in fact, the Congressional Budget Office says this measure actually adds $4 trillion more dollars to the national debt than if we'd gone over the cliff, because we didn't deal with spending.
So, but that's on the horizon. We'll have to deal with those.
Yeah, this bill actually just takes the sequestration and pushes it out 2 months. So we're back at the table in 2 months.
Now that
same time we're doing the debt limit.
Exactly. Now that saves a couple of thousand jobs, I understand, from the federal government was going to have to just start laying off people. That's probably a good thing, but they still have to deal with this down the road. Let me ask you your prognostications here. When we start looking at spending, are we looking at a bigger battle there? Because you've got two very sharp-edged arguments. One for less spending on social services, one for more lightening the rein on businesses.
New Congress is sworn in today. They really are going to be looking at a very uncomfortable 2 months. February is shaping up to be a very ugly and partisan month in Washington, where they're going to battle over a continuing resolution that's going to have to deal with these issues, certainly the sequester issue and these cuts that are supposed to automatically kick in. So to be very clear, we are in a situation where nothing really has been resolved. The markets are responding to what appears to be the right intent, but some of that criticism that's coming from Europe and in China in particular is based on the fact that austerity measures that we saw adopted in other countries, we don't seem to be moving in that direction that will really address this problem on the spending side.
Yeah, and it seems the president seems very reluctant to deal with it. I mean, the Philadelphia Inquirer had an editorial in which they said the president should have an x-ray done of his backbone, and a copy of that should be put in his wallet, so when he gets to a point again where he needs a backbone, he'll know where to find it.
Wow.
Because you had the opportunity. Congress was ready to deal with Social Security, Medicare, the two largest and biggest drivers of costs. They were willing to sit down and talk about it and deal with it. Republicans actually put it on the table. President has seemed extremely reluctant to talk about spending. And understand, this is how we got here in the first place. We got to this fiscal cliff because the president couldn't deal with, wouldn't deal on, wouldn't talk about cost-saving measures the last time the debt ceiling was raised. So that's how we got here. Now all he's done is moved it 2 months further down the road. At the same time, we're going to deal with the debt ceiling.
Now, on the other side of revenues, and let me throw this out to you, Yohuru, it's been, what, 20-some odd years since we've had a Republican House that's voted for a tax increase. Is that perhaps a lack of responsibility here, or do we credit the Republicans for saying, look, we're not going to put this on the backs of Americans?
They certainly bear responsibility in this conversation, and clearly it was the Bush-era tax cuts that helped to inaugurate some of this to begin with. But when one looks at it now, Obama owns those problems. He's president of the United States, and so now it falls on him. I think what the Democrats can say and be proud of is that in the spirit of bipartisanship, they tried to move forward and to move this conversation in a way that dealt with the temporary problem. it does not address the long-term concerns. And both sides of the aisle have to come together and to talk about some solutions that are going to be painful for the American people. If we're going to address this issue over the long term, it's going to require the type of bipartisanship that is going to be necessary to put a deal in place that actually addresses some of these issues. I think the president's been, his leadership, his approval rating now is, I think, in the 53% range. If he doesn't want to see that plummet, he does have to address these issues and maybe show a little bit more leadership and a little bit more backbone in some of these issues.
Yeah, I lay this on the president.
Let me ask you something that may be at the heart of this. Chicago Tribune did an interesting article today on the generational fight going on that is in Washington and across most of America, where you have baby boomers, the largest part of the population, looking to have those safety nets of health care and social services. And they're pushing that because they're the biggest part of the population that votes. Younger people, however, are looking for job training and subsidized college expenses. So there are two competing forces that may be driving this inability to get along in Washington. You agree?
It's clearly an element. Your Social Security, Medicare, being driven by the baby boomers coming in and wanting and needing those services. But here's where the president's got to step up and miss the opportunity. Republicans were ready to sit down and work with him to contain those costs, not over the next year, but over the next 25 years. And it is a competing interest because who's paying for those? A shrinking amount of taxpayers are paying for that. The workforce is paying for those. So they've got to deal with it because that's what's going to drive the next 25 years and the underlying financial integrity of the United States economy. And that's what's, I think, frustrating people on both sides of the aisle is you had an opportunity. The president, for whatever reason, only wanted to focus on taxes.
Well, in fairness to the president, though, you have a Republican leadership that says we are not going to raise revenues to the extent that you wanted to. I believe he had set the threshold.
What they want is they want to have an adult conversation with the president about spending.
Well, the president set the
won't
threshold.
talk about it.
He set the threshold at $250,000. Republicans said no. We're going to set it at $1 million.
Well, but they're trying to have a conversation with him about spending. If he had come to the table, let me understand. Republicans put $800 billion of tax enhancements on the table. Then they said, let's tax people at $1 million or more. They put an age change on eligibility for Medicare. They wanted to talk about the inflation factor on Social Security. The president refused to talk about those two cost drivers. All he's been focused on is taxes.
But I think it's also an indication that the president is showing some backbone on those issues that are important to him. I think the Republicans have been obstructionists and have been unwilling to compromise on certain issues. And the president is saying these are the things that I can't compromise on. We've seen more compromise from him, at least in terms of how we define the wealthy in this country, in terms of him saying, well, 250 isn't going to work. I'm willing to go to 400,000. At the end of the day, the Republicans, too, again, bear some responsibility here. When we talk about leadership, I think, when we look at what happened in the Senate, an 89-8 vote, with Joe Biden coming in and working to get that deal in place so that we had something here. That's the spirit that we've got to move forward in. But again, at the end of the day, I agree with John. They have to be difficult conversations that involve both parties being willing to compromise and to move back from some of these more extreme positions which aren't getting us anywhere.
Yeah, clearly the Republican leadership isn't playing the political game very well. They're almost tone deaf sometimes in their rhetoric. And they're going to have to show some backbone down the road in dealing with. But the president is the president. He got elected, as did the Republican Congress. They've got to sit down and start talking. And that's the thing, I guess, that frustrates Republicans. Since he's been reelected, besides meeting with leadership, how many congressmen and senators has the president met with in order to try to develop a spirit of bipartisanship? Well, zero. None. He's not reaching out and trying to build bridges to have that broader, very difficult, sensitive discussion on these big issues. He's just sitting there going, my way or the highway.
We're going to leave that argument to end this with. Maybe those guys need to confer with you too and come up with some solutions. But thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.